Hello all, and welcome to the second of 3 lectures on our topic of today, which is in slavery and enslavement and freed persons. This lecture talks about the lived realities of enslavement. As with my first lecture, I'm going to start with a note on terminology. Instead of slave, which implies agency on the part of the enslaved person, I will be using enslaved individual to reflect the reality that they did not choose to be enslaved. The same goes with master. I'll be using enslaver instead to emphasize the power dynamic. First, let's talk about something that is universal to the life of an enslaved person, regardless of where they were forced to work. As property, they were bought and sold very frequently. As already mentioned in the legal definition of slavery from the lecture on the institution of slavery, enslaved individuals were considered property and as such could be bought, sold, and traded. There was a thriving trade in enslaved individuals. Harvey number 110 gives us the record of a sale of a young girl who was exposed at birth and picked up by an enslaver. The seller guarantees that the girl is healthy, that it was not obtained through theft or forcible abduction, and that she is neither a vagrant nor a vagabond. If anyone should demonstrate that this girl or any part of her is less than what was advertised, whether the person demonstrating the problem should be Maximus, son of Bato, or the person to whom he might later legally sell the girl, the seller will return twice the sale price to the buyer. The condition as well as the behavior of the enslaved individual had to be guaranteed by the seller, as his contract shows. In addition to this, Aulus Gellius, in an excerpt not found in your book, tells us the kinds of information that must be included in the bill of sale. Let care be taken that the bill of sale for each slave be written in such a way that it can be known exactly what disease or defect each one has, which one is a runaway or a wanderer, and not innocent of any offense. So with this in mind, let's take a look at what these sources can tell us about the lived realities of the life of an enslaved person. Let us start with the rural world. The price of an enslaved individual depended on their skill level and where they came from. An unskilled adult male might sell for around 2,000 sesterces, but a skilled individual could sell for considerably more. Enslaved individuals were a luxury item in the Roman Empire. Some who were better looking or had special skills could bring very high prices on the slave market. It was not unheard of for slave marketers to try and get higher prices from their buyers by unsavory means. Harvey number 111 gives an example of this. It depicts Antony's anger at having spent a lot of money on 2 boys the marketer told him were twins, but their differing accents revealed that they weren't. The enslaver argues that he had charged such a high price precisely because they were not twins. He argued that such a wondrous similarity was nothing special in identical twins, but finding 2 boys who looked so similar from different parts of the world was in reality priceless. The lived experiences of an enslaved individual in the country was very different from that in the city. On some farms, enslaved individuals were the primary sources of harvesting, processing, and herding manpower. Varro in Harvey number 112 argues that hired hands are better than enslaved individuals for farm work because they are more likely to do a good job. He says, in all cases, I would say that it is better to cultivate more difficult land with hired hands than with slaves. The same can probably be said as well of good land and the more difficult farm tasks like planting fruit trees, picking grapes, and harvesting wheat. When you do use slaves, they should be neither timid nor arrogant. As workers in the field, enslaved individuals were seen as tools, not humans. This becomes clear in three different sources, 2 from Harvey and 1 from a different textbook, although it is mentioned in Aldrete. Harvey number 113 is from the Farming Manual by Cato. He advocates getting rid of anything no longer useful to the farm, including old and sick enslaved individuals. He states, also get rid of any older cattle, worn out plow oxen, sheep with spots, the wool, hides, old carts, worn tools, old slaves, sick slaves, and anything else that has outlived its usefulness. Varro, who was the author of the previous advice about hired workers producing better work, also lists the tools necessary for a good farm. Some men divide these into 3 categories. 1, articulate instruments, that is, slaves. 2, inarticulate instruments, that is, oxen, and 3, mute instruments, that is, carts. Harvey number 120 is also similar in that it lists enslaved individuals as farming implements that could be passed down through a will. Sabinus in his books to Vitellius clearly defines farming implements as those items that are used for producing, harvesting, and protecting crops. This would therefore include any people who cultivate the land, as well as slaves who oversee or have other positions of authority. This latter category would include the willicus, the steward, and the monitor, the overseer. All these extras are examples of the dehumanization that enslaved individuals faced. And it was not exclusive to enslaved individuals in rural settings. As you'll see when we shift to an urban setting, enslaved individuals were treated as what the Romans thought of them as, property that could be used and abused in any way the enslaver wanted. The enslaved person's experience was one of loss of personhood. Going back to our 4 types of evidence, there are vastly fewer preserved funerary monuments in honor of rural enslaved individuals than their urban counterparts. Your book lists 2 at Harvey number 144. The first one reads, "To Mars of Ficana, Agathon, slave of the emperor and steward of the estate, employees dedicated this as a gift in fulfillment of a vow. His family also participated in the dedication." The next one, much shorter, reads, "Comulus, slave of Crispinella, shepherd, who lived 35 years, is buried here." Now let's move on to what life was like in an urban environment for an enslaved individual. Your textbook says that the lives of urban slaves were generally much easier than their rustic counterparts, but we must take this with a grain of salt. Remember, all of the evidence we have is written by enslavers who never had to experience the realities of enslavement. Since people who lived in the city were generally wealthier, enslavers had the means to give better care to the people they enslaved, and the ready supply of newly enslaved people in the markets meant that enslaved people were granted freedom more regularly. Enslaved individuals were very numerous in the city, where the concentration of wealth was greater than anywhere else in the world. Less wealthy families owned slaves in smaller numbers, of course. And businessmen also used enslaved individuals as cheap labor or to work in shops, docks, or warehouses. Other enslaved individuals worked as entertainers, athletes, both gladiators and chariot drivers, and prostitutes. First, let's consider exactly how many enslaved individuals would be present in a wealthy household at a given time. This is an excerpt from Juvenal. "When a guest is about to arrive, not one of your slaves can take a break, sweep the floor, make those columns shine, clean up the dust and cobwebs. You polish the silver. You wash the fine china. The voice of the master rages when he stands over them and brandishes his whip." As I mentioned previously, satire is exaggerated, but still based on reality. So to quote your textbook, this scene was probably not atypical for an aristocratic household in which scores or even hundreds of enslaved individuals lived and worked. Harvey number 116, which gives the epitaphs of enslaved individuals of the household of the Empress Livia, the wife of Augustus, tells us exactly how specialized the roles of enslaved individuals could get. Only in the smallest households were enslaved people expected to perform every domestic task. In very large households, tasks were so specialized that it's hard to imagine the enslaved individual having enough to do to occupy his or her day. This group of people, certainly one of the largest of its day, demonstrates a great deal of specialization, a sign of the enslaver's tremendous wealth. The same can be said of Harvey number 118, which lists the epitaphs of individuals enslaved by the emperor. In addition to the normal household or business duties assigned to enslaved individuals in the imperial household also served functions in the imperial bureaucracy. We will examine these selections more closely in our class discussion. Roman society was built upon the idea that only the most moral could prosper in life. Due to this, they held very strongly to the belief that enslaved individuals were only enslaved because all enslaved individuals had innately bad natures or criminal tendencies. Your textbook gives a few examples of this. Seneca in Harvey number 117 ostensibly is speaking about not being too wrapped up in worldly possessions to the point where you lament when your enslaved individual runs away. This not only speaks to the dehumanization of enslaved individuals in the Roman world, since enslaved individuals are placed under the same heading as household items. But at the end of the account, he also reveals his thoughts about those whom fortune, and fortune is in scare quotes for a reason, enslaves. He says, "You see, a slave household requires clothing and food. We must always be tending to the bellies of these exceptionally greedy animals. We must buy clothing and at the same time guard their extremely rapacious hands. We must use those slaves who constantly cry and curse." The second example of this is from Pliny in Harvey number 123, who often touted his own virtues. This included fair and kind treatment of his enslaved individuals. In a different letter, he claims he allowed his enslaved individuals to write wills as if they were real people who could possess and bequeath property to heirs. In this letter, Pliny records how some enslaved people murdered their enslaver. And while he says that the enslaver in some way deserved what he got because he had been excessively cruel to his slaves, he also adds some comments about what he describes as the base and criminal nature of enslaved individuals. He says, "You see how many dangers, threats, and mockeries surround us. It is also not the case that a master can protect himself by being lax in his discipline or kind. The slave's opinion of their masters is not what kills, but rather their criminal nature." This account also gives evidence to the fact that in the Roman world, if one enslaved person was accused of killing their enslaver, all enslaved individuals in that household were to be put to death. Even the more faithful and enslaved individuals and concubines who lamented his death were put to death for the actions of all of them. Harvey number 119 tells a story of an enslaved individual who was so faithful to his enslaver that he was willing to pretend to be him when he got proscripted and was sentenced to death. He says, "I should also mention the admirable faithfulness of the slave of Urbinius Panopio. His master had been listed in the proscriptions. When he learned that the other household slaves had turned Panopio in and soldiers were coming to his country estate villa in Riate, the slave changed clothes with him. He even put on his master's signet ring and sent him out the back door so that he could escape. The slave then went into a bedroom and climbed into bed and allowed himself to be killed as Panopio." Enslaved individuals were expected to put the lives of their masters before their own, but it was not often when they had to put this to the test. This stands in contrast to the depiction of enslaved individuals as morally inferior to their enslavers we saw before. However, the story was written about an enslaver by an enslaver, so the information in it may not be depicted accurately. Who is to say the enslaver, Panopio, did not ask his enslaved individual, who isn't even named, to switch places with him? Now let's turn to how enslaved individuals were treated by their enslavers. I've hinted at the conditions previously, but this section will make it very clear that to be enslaved in Rome, whether in a rural setting or an urban setting, was not a pleasant experience. Since enslaved individuals were considered property, the enslaver could do whatever he wanted to his enslaved. Harsh treatment was sometimes seen as the best way of avoiding enslaved people revolting. When they testified in court, the law required that enslaved individuals be tortured. Otherwise, what they said could not be taken as the truth. Cato, who we saw previously as lumping his enslaved individuals amongst things that should be sold when deemed useless, also had the reputation of not treating his enslaved people well. Plutarch, a Greek historian interested in Rome, writes the following: "Cato owned many slaves and usually bought those prisoners of war who were young and still capable of being reared and trained like calves or colts. None of his slaves entered the house of another man unless Cato or his wife had expressly sent him there. If the slave was asked what Cato was doing, he was always ordered to respond, 'I don't know.' Cato expected his slaves either to be at work or asleep. Indeed, he preferred the sleepy ones, as he considered them more docile than the wakeful ones. Also, those who were able to sleep were generally better off for their work than those who did not sleep enough. Believing that a slave's sexual passions were one of the main reasons he might get into trouble, Cato allowed the males to have sexual relations with the females for a fixed price, but he never allowed them to approach any other women." This passage really emphasizes the ways in which enslaved individuals were seen as not human to their enslavers. Cato only buys people who are easy to train, like young animals, as the line "who were young and still capable of being reared and trained like calves and colts" suggests. The line "Cato expected his slaves to either be at work or sleep" also tells us a lot about the dehumanization of enslaved individuals. Like tools, enslaved individuals are only useful when doing something, and if they aren't, they'd better be asleep rather than taking a break. Finally, the line Cato allowed the males to have sexual relations with the females for a fixed price tells us that Cato basically prostituted his enslaved women to his enslaved men. While prostitutes were usually enslaved women, relations amongst enslaved people in a household usually weren't treated as a form of prostitution. Adding to the evidence that enslaved individuals were seen as subhuman and almost animalistic to their enslavers is the fact that several name collars have been found across the empire. The inscriptions on these objects record the name of the enslaved individual and inform the reader to whom they were enslaved, in case the enslaved individual chose to run away. These may have been seen as a form of punishment for bad behavior or attempting to escape. Since they were regarded as property, when an enslaved individual ran away, the actual crime in the Romans' eyes was theft because they had stolen themselves from their masters. Thus, some enslavers outfitted their enslaved individuals with collars that had messages such as these. I am Petronia. Apprehend me because I am fled. Return me to the house of Teodotens, to my master Vitalio. Apprehend me because I have fled. Return me to my master Cethegus, a man of senatorial status. He is near the marketplace of Livia in the 3rd region of the city. I am the slave of the administrative clerk Leontius. Apprehend me so that I not escape and return me to Triarius Street. Apprehend me because I have fled and return me to the Via Lata in Geminillus the physician. I am the prostitute Adulteria. Apprehend me because I have fled from the city of Bulla Regia. These were exactly the same as modern dog tags, both in purpose and appearance. Thus, slaves were seen as animals rather than humans. Because slaves legally were mere property and had no official status, Roman law sanctioned the use of torture against slaves who were to be questioned during court cases. As Harvey number 124 reads, the courts should only resort to the torture of slaves when the accused is already suspected of being guilty, and a guilty verdict is so close by other arguments that only the confession of the accused slaves would seem to be lacking. In fact, Roman law believed that slaves could only give truthful testimony under torture. In the Republic and early Empire, Roman citizens were exempt from torture in legal cases. By the late Empire, however, torture was used on poor free persons. Harvey number 125 gives us an example of an enslaved individual who remained loyal to his enslaver even under torture. While your textbook uses this as another example of a faithful slave, just like the other faithful slave narrative, I urge you to treat stories like this with skepticism. Since it is written from the perspective of an enslaver, many things could be elided, including whether or not the enslaver asked the enslaved individual to do this for him, or whether there was a threat of punishment if he did not remain loyal. This can be seen in this scene from HBO's Rome, where Attia, Caesar's sister, feels she can only accuse Servilia, Caesar's lover, of trying to kill her if one of her slaves confesses under torture.
Me, you don't know. What was that?
Mother!
Octavia.
What?
What's her name again?
Jocasta?
She's a bad influence.
Oh, I say.
What are you doing? Who is this?
One of the servants tried to poison me.
What have you been doing to the servants that they want to murder you?
Nothing. This is Servilia's work. With Antony gone, she thinks she can just do as she pleases.
If you know it's her, why are you torturing him?
Because it isn't a legal confession unless there's torture.
To take Servilia to court.
No. I'm gonna kill her. And if I get taken to court for it, then I can always claim it was self-defense. I'm thinking ahead, you see?
This is wrong in so many ways, I don't know where to start.
Well, what would you have me do? Who would protect us if I didn't?
I'm... If you don't mind...
No, don't go. I need you as an independent witness. Take her away. Timon, is this going to take all night?
He's out again. Bring him round.
Wait. Give me a name, boy. Give me a name and I will spare your life. You want to live, don't you? Tell me then, for your life.
Sevilla.
There. That wasn't so hard, was it? After you've killed him, dispose of the body discreetly.
Although this show has many problems with historical accuracy, it depicts the treatment of enslaved individuals pretty accurately. Many times characters are seen beating or mistreating their enslaved individuals in their households. It was not just the male pater familias of the household who could be cruel to his enslaved individuals. Juvenal, in his satire against women, depicts women who are extremely cruel to the enslaved individuals in their households and really don't care. If during the night her husband sleeps with his back to her, his female secretary suffers. The wardrobe girls pull down their tunics to receive their lashings. She accuses her litter bearer of being late and punishes him for oversleeping. One woman prefers rods cracked over her slave's back, another whips, and a third straps. Some women even pay their professional slave torturers an annual salary. However, with all satire, we need to remember that this is exaggerated. This exaggeration hints at the historical reality, though. While women held pretty low status in their household compared to any male relative, they could assert their dominance through cruelty to enslaved individuals of their household. Not every master or mistress treated their people they enslaved this way, but passages like this suggest that abuse was not unheard of. We will save discussion of Harvey number 128 for class. Harvey number 127 for class, and move on to Harvey number 128, which are some legal constraints on enslavers. Just like with the treatment of sons by the paterfamilias, there were social constraints against extreme abuse of enslaved individuals by their enslavers. Social pressures, however, were not the only constraint upon masters' treatment of their enslaved individuals. Roman law increasingly limited the power of the paterfamilias' ability to punish and kill the enslaved individuals in his potestas. This passage from Gaius's legal compendium shows how Roman law placed enslaved individuals completely under the power of their masters as property, but that there were laws in place to keep the masters from being excessively cruel. It says, "Therefore, slaves are in our potestas. This is the power of life and death over our slaves. This power of life and death over our slaves is part of the universal law as it appears in the law codes of all peoples. Although that is true, however, it is allowed neither to Roman citizens nor to anyone under Roman rule the right to treat slaves excessively cruelly and without cause. Anyone who kills one of his own slaves without just cause will be punished with no more leniency than someone who kills a slave belonging to someone else." In reading this as leniency, we should keep in mind the very late date at which Antoninus Pius was emperor. The legal constraints that the Emperor Antoninus Pius imposed were the culmination of a series of laws passed by emperors in the 1st and 2nd century CE, as Harvey number 129 shows. One of the most interesting legal texts to survive from antiquity is a fragmentary stone inscription of the 1st century AD from the Campanian town of Puteoli, quoting a law regulating professional undertakers. In addition to the collection of bodies, the undertakers could also be hired as professional torturers and executioners. This law takes the job of torture and execution from the hands of the master and gives it to public contractors. This text outlines the procedures the masters and contractors were to follow when a slave was to be tortured. As physical abuse of slaves often came in the heat of the moment, as with Juvenal's cruel mistress, while the master was most angry, such drawn-out preparations might cause a master whose temper had cooled to stop a severe punishment before it was carried out. This reads, in the case of those who wish to inflict punishment on a male or female slave privately, i.e. in the household, the law prescribes the following for one who wishes to inflict the punishment. In the case of crucifixion, the contractor will provide the beams, chains, and ropes for the punishment, as well as the punishers themselves. The person wishing to have the punishment inflicted is to pay 4 sestertii for each worker, the people carrying the beams, the floggers, and the executioner. Thus, it is possible to see enslavement as a form of social death, which is the condition of people not accepted as fully human by wider society. Social death had both internal and external effects on enslaved people, changing their views of themselves and the way they were regarded by society. A captive would be spared from death and created a slave, although this was a conditional commutation since death was only suspended as long as the slave submitted to powerlessness. Any aspect that alienated the slaves from their previous identities and symbolized their loss of freedom and power and their total dependency on their master's will was an aspect of social death. This includes changing names. A lot of enslaved individuals' names we have are based on their characteristics and appearances and weren't probably the ones they were given at birth. The psychological process of social death included the effect of rejection as a member of society and becoming genealogically isolated through the loss of heritage and the right to pass on their ancestry to their children. In fact, all social bonds were seen as illegitimate unless they were validated by the master. We can see this in Pliny's humane treatment of his enslaved individuals. He grants them the ability to do things a free member of society could do without permission. Enslaved people were denied an independent social structure and were not even deemed fully human, as they were only seen as a representation of their master and had no honor and power of their own. Thus, power played an essential role in the relationship between an enslaved person and their enslaver, and violence was often deemed a necessary component of slavery. An enslaved person was seen to have no worth. They had no name of their own and no honor. Instead, their worth and honor was transferred to the enslaver and gave him an elevated social status among his peers. Violence within the relationship was considered essential because of the low motivation of the enslaved people, and it was also a factor in creating social death and exercising power over the enslaved individuals. Whipping was not only a method of punishment, but also a consciously chosen symbolic device to remind enslaved individuals of their subhuman status.